My wife had spent months turning away from any form of intimacy. Then, out of nowhere, she brought up the idea of having a baby, something that should have sparked joy, but instead sent a chill down my spine. Because by then, I already had my suspicions. I suspected she was pregnant, and quietly, I started plotting a revenge she would never see coming. It all began with what, under different circumstances, might have been an ordinary, even exciting conversation. Maria and I were having dinner. I was talking about my day when, without lifting her eyes from her plate, she said, "I think we should have a baby." At first, I was stunned. This was a topic we'd sidestepped for years, and I wasn't sure whether she truly meant it or if it was just a passing thought. The way she said it lacked all the warmth or joy I'd imagined would come with such a moment. She threw it out there casually, as if suggesting we get takeout for dinner. What made it even more bizarre was the state of our relationship. We weren't exactly in a good place. For months, I'd sensed a growing distance between us. We didn't talk the way we used to. And as for physical connection, that had all but vanished. There was always a reason. She was too tired, too busy, needed personal space. I tried to be understanding, told myself it was just a phase. But when she mentioned the baby, something in my brain flipped. That night, I couldn't shake off what she'd said. I tried rationalizing it. Maybe this was her way of trying to reconnect, to fix things between us. But deep down, something felt off. Over the next few weeks, I began paying closer attention. She started leaving earlier for work and getting home later than usual. She spent an unusual amount of time glued to her phone, which wasn't like her. And every time I tried to ask how she was doing or what was going on, she brushed it off. "There's nothing wrong. I'm just tired," she'd say. But I knew it wasn't just fatigue. That excuse had worn thin. Sometimes I wonder if I should have acted sooner, confronted my doubts instead of sweeping them under the rug. But at that moment, I just couldn't bring myself to admit something was truly broken. The days after that dinner felt strange, to say the least. I couldn't get her words out of my head. "I think we should have a baby." That sentence replayed in my mind like a stuck record. I tried to pretend everything was fine, but something deep inside kept whispering that it wasn't. The changes were subtle at first. Maria started heading out earlier in the morning, something she never used to do. She'd come home late, saying she had back-to-back meetings. I kept telling myself it was just work stress, but every time she walked out the door, my unease grew. And then there was her phone. We'd always had a pretty open dynamic, no snooping, no secrets. But suddenly it became her constant companion. Every time a message came in, she'd glance quickly, then tuck her phone away like it was classified information. The final straw came one afternoon when I got home earlier than expected. It had been a rough day, and I just wanted to unwind. As I climbed the stairs to our bedroom, I froze. There was a scent lingering in the air, sweet, floral, unfamiliar. It wasn't hers, it wasn't mine. She wasn't home, so I quietly looked around the room for the source. Nothing seemed out of place, except for her favorite blouse draped over the back of a chair. I lifted it to my nose, and there it was. That same unfamiliar perfume, strong and undeniable. I stood there, frozen. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but I couldn't deny the obvious either. Why would her shirt smell like a fragrance I'd never smelled on her before? If it was new, why hadn't she mentioned it? I decided not to say anything that night, but my mind wouldn't stop racing. The moment that shattered everything came a few days later. Maria was in the shower, and her phone, left on the living room shelf, buzzed with a message. I noticed it by chance as I walked past, but something caught my eye, a heart emoji next to the name Daniel. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, maybe a coworker, a friend, but my gut was screaming the truth I didn't want to face. That night, as we lay in bed, I watched her silently. The questions were there, pressing at the back of my throat, begging to be spoken. But I couldn't bring myself to say them out loud. Maybe I was afraid of the truth, or maybe I simply wasn't ready for it. A few days had passed since I saw that message on her phone, and something in me had shifted. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. What once seemed like harmless coincidences were starting to form a troubling pattern. I found myself constantly on edge, like some unseen presence was haunting me, but I had no idea how to confront it. That week, while Maria was away at work, I decided to tidy up the house, anything to keep my mind busy. It felt like a good distraction. There was always something to clean, something to sort. When I got to the bathroom, I focused on emptying the trash can. It was just a routine chore until something at the bottom stopped me cold. Hidden beneath used tissues and makeup wrappers, there it was, a pregnancy test. My heart stalled. I told myself it had to be negative, maybe just one of those impulsive purchases people forget about. But when I pulled it out and looked closely, there they were, two clear pink lines. The room seemed to lose its air. My head spun, flooded with questions and theories that clashed into each other. Maria had never said anything about wanting to take a pregnancy test. What rattled me more was that we hadn't even been intimate in months. I sat on the edge of the bathtub, still holding the test, trying to steady my breath, but my thoughts were in overdrive. Maybe it was old, I reasoned. Maybe she took it ages ago and just forgot about it. But why would it be hidden in the trash, buried like a secret? I couldn't decide if I should confront her. And if I did, what would I even say? How would I explain finding it without sounding like I'd been snooping or losing my mind? That evening, Maria came home later than usual. She was calm, like everything was perfectly normal. While she cooked, she told me how draining her day had been, and I did my best to respond like I wasn't drowning in suspicion. But inside, I was carrying a weight so heavy it was starting to crush me. I chose to stay quiet for now. I wanted to observe, gather more pieces of the puzzle before making a move. From that moment on, I dissected everything she did, every word she spoke, looking for clues like breadcrumbs that might lead me to the truth. After finding that test, every day turned into a waiting game. I tried to act like nothing had changed, but inside, I was unraveling. I couldn't stop thinking about what it meant, what Maria might be hiding from me. I started paying attention to every small detail, desperate for answers. That's how one evening, while searching through our desk for an old receipt, I stumbled across something that made my blood run cold. It was a wrinkled envelope with the logo of a fertility clinic. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a recent receipt and an appointment slip, but it was what I found on the back of the paper that truly stole my breath. A handwritten note. "It's all going to be okay. Trust me." I stared at it for what felt like an eternity. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. Who wrote it? And more importantly, why had Maria gone to a fertility clinic without telling me? My stomach churned as a mixture of anger and fear rose in my chest. I felt betrayed, confused, and terrified of what it all might mean. Maybe I was seeing ghosts where there were none. But then I remembered the pregnancy test, the unfamiliar perfume, the cryptic messages on her phone. No, this wasn't just my imagination. There was something else going on, something she wasn't telling me. That night, I barely slept. Maria lay beside me, fast asleep, while I tossed and turned, trapped inside my own thoughts. Part of me wanted to shake her awake right then and there, demand answers. But the other part, the scared part, knew I wasn't ready to hear the truth. The next morning, I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore. I needed answers, but I didn't know how to ask without making it sound like an accusation. So I tried to ease into it. Over breakfast, I asked how she was feeling, if there was anything she wanted to talk to me about. Maria gave me a faint smile, the kind you wear when you're pretending everything's fine. But her eyes avoided mine, and that alone spoke louder than any words. As she stepped out for work, I stayed behind, watching the door close slowly behind her. For the first time since this all began, I saw her not as the woman I married, but as someone I barely recognized. I didn't know how to start with Maria. I could have confronted her with what I knew, laid it all bare, but deep down I sensed it would only open the door for more lies. Or worse, she'd flip the script and make me the villain. So I kept quiet, kept digging. I needed more. That afternoon, I went through her phone again. Yeah, I know how that sounds. But I don't regret it, not one bit. I noticed something I'd missed before. Daniel, the guy who was slipping into my marriage like a thief, had a profile picture on WhatsApp. Nothing flashy, just him, grinning beside a woman and two young kids. At first, I assumed it was maybe his sister or cousins, but something about it didn't sit right. I opened his profile, saved the number to my phone. If this guy had secrets, I was ready to find them. That night, once Maria was asleep, I searched him up online. Didn't take long. His Facebook was basically a family photo album. Him, the woman from the picture, his wife, as confirmed by a comment congratulating them on their anniversary, and the kids who were clearly theirs. Suddenly, the puzzle pieces started to snap into place. He wasn't just sneaking around with my wife. He was lying to his whole family, too. And if he thought he was going to get away with it, he had another thing coming. The next morning, I used a burner number and sent his wife a message. No theatrics, just the truth. Your husband Daniel is having an affair with my wife, Maria. I have proof. Call me if you want to know more. She didn't take long to respond. My phone rang within minutes. Her voice trembled at first, but underneath it was a quiet fury that said she needed answers. I laid it all out for her. The texts, the pictures, even the trip they'd planned together. I sent her screenshots of everything. For a moment, she didn't say a word. The silence on the line was deafening. Then she said, "Thank you for telling me." Her tone was cool, but there was steel in it. I knew then she wasn't going to let this slide. With Daniel exposed, it was time to turn to Maria. I couldn't just let her walk away unscathed. She hadn't only betrayed me. She'd done it in front of everyone who ever believed in her. That same afternoon, I crafted an email. I attached every screenshot, every message, every picture that proved what she and Daniel had been doing. I didn't send it to her. I sent it to her parents and her sister. No dramatics, no bitterness. Just a short, blunt message. I think you deserve to know the truth. Maria has been cheating on me with this man. I've attached proof. I'm sorry to be the one to tell you, but I can't stay silent anymore. That night, when Maria came home, her phone wouldn't stop buzzing. At first, she tried to ignore it. Then she finally looked, and the color drained from her face. That was when I knew it had landed. "What did you do?" she screamed, her voice a cocktail of panic and rage. "I did what you deserved," I answered calmly. "I let the truth come out. Now everyone knows who you really are." Maria launched into a storm of excuses, how things hadn't been right between us, how Daniel made her feel seen, how she never meant to hurt me. But by then, her words didn't matter. Her actions had already said everything. That same night, Daniel's wife confronted him. Word got back to me that she kicked him out and filed for divorce. Maria, meanwhile, was left to face a heartbroken family. For the first time in months, I felt at peace. It wasn't about revenge. Not exactly. It was about reclaiming my life. I wasn't stuck in her web of lies anymore. Maria and Daniel's relationship, as expected, didn't last long after that. But I didn't care. I was focused on rebuilding, on making sure no one would ever make me feel this small again. That night, after everything came crashing down, I knew things couldn't stay the same. I wasn't going to let Maria stay in my house, in our house, after what she had done. I had already endured enough humiliation. Now it was my turn to act. I sat in the living room, with the lights dimmed, as she paced back and forth like a ghost, frantically checking her phone. Her mother had sent her a heartbreaking message. Her face was tense, her emotions bubbling just under the surface. But there wasn't even a flicker of remorse in her expression, only a simmering anger, like she still believed I was to blame for everything. Finally, she stopped in front of me, arms folded tightly across her chest. "What are you going to do now?" she asked, her voice sharp and condescending, like she still thought she held the upper hand. "Simple," I said, keeping my voice as even as I could. "You're leaving." She blinked, clearly thrown off. "What? You're leaving?" I repeated, this time with more conviction. "This house is mine. I don't want to see you here again. You've got 1 hour to pack your things." For a moment, she looked stunned, like she couldn't quite process it. I was always the one who avoided fights, the one who apologized even when I hadn't done anything wrong. But not this time. This time, I meant every word. I stood up from the couch, walked calmly to the door, and swung it wide open. "Your time starts now." First, she tried the tears. "How can you do this to me after everything we've been through?" The irony in her words almost made me laugh. "You really want to talk about everything we've been through?" I said, nodding toward her phone, "because it seems like together was the last thing on your mind." Then she turned defensive. "What about everything I did for this home? For us? You can't just kick me out like this." Oh, you want to talk about all you did? I shot back. Great. You did an excellent job tearing down everything we built. So, yes, I can kick you out, and I am. After a few more minutes of going in circles, Maria finally realized I wasn't backing down. She grabbed a suitcase, tossed in the essentials, and headed for the door. She paused for a moment, looking back at me with something twisted between hate and what almost looked like a silent plea. It didn't have to end like this, she whispered. No, it didn't, I replied. But here we are. I shut the door behind her. I stood there for a beat, letting the silence sink in, heavier than ever. For the first time in months, I felt like I had some control over my life again. The next morning, I woke up early. The house felt bigger, emptier, but in a strange way, it also felt lighter. I brewed a pot of coffee, sat down at the kitchen table, and let the quiet wrap around me. It wasn't the ending I once imagined, but it was the one I needed. Later that day, a buddy of mine called. He'd already heard what happened. Turns out Maria's family didn't waste any time spreading the news. He asked if I was okay, and all I could say was, better than I've been in a long time. That night, I opened a bottle of wine I'd been saving for a special moment. It wasn't exactly a celebration, but it was definitely closure. I poured a glass, looked around the house, and something hit me. I'd made it through. Those first few days post-breakup were a storm of emotion. I'd wake up each morning with a dull ache in my chest, that hollow sense that something, someone, was missing. Everything around me reminded me of Maria, the way she folded towels, the songs we used to sing along to. Even the silence had its own way of echoing her presence. I tried to bury that emptiness by keeping busy. I got up at dawn, ran loops around the park, and spent hours rearranging furniture in my tiny apartment. It was my way of staying distracted, anything to keep from drowning in my own sorrow. But some nights, the sadness was impossible to outrun. That's when it hit hardest. Late at night, when the house was still and I was alone with my thoughts, staring at the ceiling, replaying all the moments that went wrong. And yet, gradually, something started to shift. It was subtle at first, almost unnoticeable, but it was real. I realized that, for the first time in a long while, I had space, room to breathe, room to think about what I wanted, who I was, what made me happy. That's when I picked up my guitar again. It had been years. My fingers were clumsy, rusty, but as soon as I strummed those first few chords, something inside me clicked. I wasn't perfect, not even close, but those sounds reminded me that some things in life still belonged to me, things no one could take away. I also started reconnecting with old friends. Some of them had been there all along, but I'd withdrawn, buried in my routine and the constant weight of my relationship. One night, I said yes to an invite to a local bar. I didn't want to go at first, but that small decision turned out to be one of the best ones I'd made in a long time. Over beers and laughter, I realized something. I could still enjoy life. The world hadn't stopped just because my marriage had ended. Every little step forward felt like a small victory. Moving forward, signing up for rock climbing classes, even cooking for myself, were constant reminders that I was making progress, that I was learning to be okay on my own. It wasn't easy, but with each passing day, it felt a little less heavy than the last. There were days when the memory of Maria still stung. I thought about what we had shared, what we had lost, and what she had chosen to leave behind. But instead of letting those thoughts consume me, I learned to accept them. They were part of my story, but they didn't define my future. The days following the breakup were a roller coaster, just as expected. Some days, it felt like I was moving forward, while other times, everything seemed to crumble once again. It was a slow process, but I began to realize something. What scared me the most wasn't being alone, but discovering who I was without the relationship. For so long, my life had revolved around Maria and what we had together. It wasn't that I regretted it, but I realized that, at some point, I had forgotten about myself. It was as if my identity had been tied to that relationship, and now that it was no longer there, I had to rebuild myself from scratch. One day, while going through my emails, I found an invitation to a local rock climbing event. It was something I'd always wanted to try, but I never had the courage to, since Maria didn't find it interesting. I decided to sign up. At first, I felt awkward, out of place, But with every failed attempt, every controlled fall, something within me began to stir. It wasn't just the physical challenge. It was the sense of confronting the unknown and pushing through. I also made another important decision. I booked a trip for myself. No explanations, no permissions, no questions asked. It was just me and my backpack. I ended up in a small coastal town I'd always wanted to visit. I wandered the cobblestone streets, ate at little family-owned restaurants, and spent hours gazing at the sea. I realized I didn't need grand plans or constant company to feel at peace. Not everything was so enlightening. There were nights when I felt lonely, when doubts came rushing back with full force. But instead of running from those feelings, I learned to embrace them. Sometimes sadness doesn't completely disappear. It just becomes a part of you, one that you can carry without it weighing you down too much. Looking back today, I no longer feel anger or pain. What I feel is clarity. I understood that there was nothing I could have done to prevent what happened with Maria. Her betrayal wasn't a reflection of my worth, but of her own choices. And while that experience was tough, it forced me to reevaluate everything, to ask myself who I wanted to be and what I wanted from my life. I don't know what the future holds, but I do know I'm better equipped to face it. I've learned to listen to myself, to prioritize myself, and most importantly, to never take who I am for granted. If anyone here is going through something similar, my only advice would be this: don't be afraid to start over. Though the process may be painful, you will find a strength within yourself you never knew existed. If this story resonated with you in any way, I'd love for you to be a part of us. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this one. Also, if you enjoyed it, give it a like and share your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done in my place? I love reading your stories and perspectives because in the end, we all learn a little from each other's experiences.